Cromwell's legendary army was facing certain demise, trapped by sickness and an enemy outnumbered 3-1. What followed was an audacious dawn attack that turned this desperate, muddy trap into his greatest victory. The year was 1650, and the great general found himself sealed into a coastal coffin. The conflict wasn't just military, it was a third civil war, ignited by deep religious and political fissures. After executing King Charles I and establishing the English Commonwealth, a move the Scottish Covenanters viewed as regicide and heresy, the Scots crowned the late king's son, Charles II, effectively daring England to invade. Cromwell, as Captain General of the formidable New Model Army, had marched north, expecting a swift, decisive battle that would crush this threat to the fledgling republic. Instead, he met the brilliant, patient, and elusive strategy of the veteran Scottish general David Leslie. Leslie, a professional soldier who had served in the Swedish army during the 30 Years' War, had learned a crucial lesson. Never face Cromwell head-on when the terrain favors delay. Leslie executed a flawless campaign of attrition and denial. He systematically avoided open battle, shadowing the English forces, burning crops, cutting supply lines, and emptying the garrisons ahead of Cromwell's advance. For weeks, the English columns had slogged through hostile, rain-swept territory, every step a torment. The Scottish people, united by the Covenant, a strict Presbyterian oath, offered no quarter and no succor to the invading army of sectaries and independents. The landscape itself seemed to collude with the enemy. The once invincible New Model Army, the engine of the English Revolution, was steadily dissolving, not by the sword, but by the insidious, invisible enemies of sickness, exposure, and starvation. The relentless chill and dampness of the Scottish weather gnawed away at their strength, leading to pneumonia and rampant infection. By the time they reached the small coastal town of Dunbar, 1/3 of the army, approximately 4,000 men, was already sidelined by the dreaded bloody flux, dysentery, fever, and sheer malnutrition. The veterans who remained looked less like the legendary Ironsides and more like spectral figures, their faces gaunt, hollowed by weeks of defeat and disease, their once vibrant red coats faded and stained irrevocably with mud and seawater. Cromwell, a man whose entire worldview was underpinned by an intense, unshakable, personal faith in a personal guiding providence, knew the terrifying arithmetic. He had roughly 10,000 effective fighting men left. They were perishing faster than he could fight or retreat. Their only viable escape was a humiliating evacuation by sea, an open admission of strategic failure that would likely dissolve the Commonwealth government back in London. Retreat south by land was the only other option, but General Leslie had closed that door with professional finality. Cromwell's faith was being tested in the extreme. He spent hours in prayerful, solitary agony, searching the dismal horizon for a clear sign that God had not abandoned the cause of the Puritan Revolution. Leslie had perfectly orchestrated the trap, using geography as his ally. As Cromwell's 10,000 desperate men huddled in the narrow fields surrounding Dunbar, seeking meager shelter from the biting sea wind, Leslie moved his own army of 22,000 men, fresh, well-supplied, and fired by religious zeal, into an impregnable position. This Scottish force was a powerful spectacle of national and spiritual fervor, their blue Covenanter banners flying high, their ranks robust, confident, and eager to deliver the final righteous blow against the hated regicides. The trap was sprung at the narrowest point of the coastal road, a natural choke point called Cockburn's Path. The steep, rugged Lammermuir hills, impassable for a large army with equipment, ran sharply down to the coast, leaving only a tiny, constricted strip of land for the road south. To the English left, the hills rose abruptly, a natural, impenetrable wall towering over the camp. To their right, the grey, unforgiving North Sea hammered the shore, making naval escape uncertain at best. Cromwell's army was jammed into a tiny space, cut off from food, reinforcement and escape. They were compressed onto a damp, small peninsula, barely 2 miles across, facing inevitable surrender or annihilation. The general looked up at the heights, at the massed Scottish colours fluttering tauntingly on the crest of Doon Hill, and knew his army was trapped like a lone wolf in a narrow canyon. Leslie had won the campaign without firing a single shot. This was the moment of ultimate checkmate. Cromwell penned letters to Parliament that day, not of defiance, but of grim, honest resignation, informing them that his army was likely doomed. But the Scottish army, despite its overwhelming advantage, was harbouring a catastrophic flaw more dangerous than Cromwell's pikes: the arrogance of spiritual certainty. The Scottish Covenanter army, arrayed across the dominating high ground of Doon Hill, watched the English struggle below, utterly convinced that God had delivered their hated enemy into their hands. The hill offered a vast, sweeping, almost godlike view of the miserable English camp, giving the Scots absolute control of the battlefield. Leslie's strategy was simple, flawless, and guaranteed to succeed. Maintain the high ground and let dysentery and starvation complete the demise of the English army. He was a professional, cautious master of defence, who knew better than to provoke the desperation of Cromwell's veteran soldiers in a direct charge. Yet, this perfect defence held the seeds of its own destruction, rooted not in rational military calculation, but in the overwhelming zealotry of the Scottish command structure. Leslie was perpetually shadowed by a terrifying, politically powerful contingent of Covenanter ministers, men like Archibald Johnston of Warriston, whose religious authority superseded Leslie's military expertise. These hardline clergymen viewed the campaign not as a geopolitical conflict, but as a divine crusade, a holy war, to eliminate the world of Cromwell's supposed heresy. They argued vehemently that to wait was sinful cowardice, a betrayal of the direct opportunity granted by Providence. They saw the vast, trapped English army below as a clear, unmissable instruction to descend from the heights and destroy the Amalekites swiftly, lest God's patience expire. Compounding the pressure, these ministers had already purged the Scottish ranks of thousands of experienced but insufficiently zealous officers and men, the so-called malignants, fundamentally weakening the army's professional core in favor of religious fervor. The lack of experienced cavalry and infantry commanders would soon prove fatal. The political and theological pressure became an immense crushing weight upon Leslie, transforming the command tent into a site of perpetual, agonizing conflict. Leslie argued desperately for patience, citing the tactical dangers of descending into the confined space. But the fervent demands of the ministers and the restless enthusiasm of his zealous junior officers finally overwhelmed his military judgment. He knew the risk, but the political cost of appearing irresolute was too high. Leslie, a pragmatic soldier, but a man deeply committed to the Covenant, felt compelled to submit to the spiritual and political will of the nation. On the 1st of September, he gave the fateful, disastrous order. The army would abandon the high ground and move off Doon Hill and closer to the English position, aiming to seal the coastal gap with their sheer bulk and force a decisive, immediate surrender. He had willfully traded a perfect, unassailable defensive fortress for a contested, cramped and disadvantageous battlefield, and from the English side, Cromwell had just spotted the catastrophic, history-altering error. The tactical movement of the Scottish army that night, from the evening of the 2nd to the morning of the 3rd of September, was a masterpiece of strategic folly, driven by theological impatience. The Covenanters descended from the relative safety of Doon Hill and began to crowd into the restricted space on the low ground. It was the slow, disorganized shuffle of a massive host, their logistics and command structure instantly breaking down as they moved. They pushed too far and too fast, creating a fatal bottleneck as thousands of men, horses, and heavy wagons funneled into a limited area. In shifting his entire force to block the coastal road, Leslie inadvertently pulled his entire army onto treacherous, difficult terrain. The majority of his men, particularly his finest cavalry and infantry, were now compressed into a tight, dense area, their ability to maneuver severely restricted by the steep banks of the Spotburn and the broken ground that ran toward the sea. The Spotburn, a seemingly insignificant stream with treacherous soft banks, became a critical tactical barrier, preventing the easy deployment of the Scottish masses and separating his wings. Crucially, the Scottish right flank, closest to the English camp, was now dangerously congested, isolated, and effectively cut off from the main body by a deep ravine. Leslie had completely turned his overwhelming 3-to-1 numbers into an active, centralized liability, a huge, vulnerable target. Cromwell, whose eyesight and tactical genius were his keenest weapon in battle, immediately recognized the peering through the early evening gloom from his headquarters at Broxmouth House, his gaze piercing the misty outlines of the Scottish deployment. He saw the colossal blunder. The Scottish movement had created a vulnerable, isolated flank and placed the largest, most potent part of their army in the worst possible formation. The general's despair was instantly replaced by the terrifying, calm clarity of a commander who realizes his death sentence has just been commuted into a moment of impossible triumph. "The Lord hath delivered them into our hands," he reportedly exclaimed to General Lambert, his face momentarily illuminated by the lantern light, showing a fierce joy that only religious certainty could provide. Cromwell's generals, including the formidable John Lambert and George Monk, quickly confirmed the analysis. The Scottish right wing was exposed, isolated, and tightly packed against the ravine. The decision was made, an all-or-nothing attack before dawn. It was a gamble of insane proportions, to launch 10,000 sick men against 22,000 fresh opponents. But Cromwell saw the enemy's blunder not as mere luck, but as a direct, purposeful opening delivered by Providence to save his army and his cause. They would attack the Scottish right flank in overwhelming force, annihilating it before the rest of the vast Scottish army could pivot and deploy. The plan was audacious. Under the cover of the pre-dawn darkness, the English would launch a lightning-fast, highly concentrated attack aimed directly at the congested Scottish right flank. The bulk of Cromwell's best cavalry and infantry would be covertly shifted from their defensive position on the English left, stacked onto the extreme right, to deliver a single, overwhelming hammer blow that would shatter the packed enemy formation before the rest of the Scottish army could even begin to react. The clock was ticking. The sound of rain on the canvas tents mixed with the distant muffled noises of the massive Scottish army settling into their poor position. If the Scots realized their catastrophic error and pulled their men back to the commanding heights before the first light of dawn, the whole audacious plan would be instantly doomed. The preparations were carried out with the silent, terrifying precision that only the new model army could muster. Regiments of foot and horse were carefully, whisperingly moved across the field, their heavy boots muffled in the wet grass. Officers spoke in low, terse commands. The clink of steel and the creak of leather were suppressed by iron discipline. Every soldier knew the stakes were their lives, the future of the Commonwealth, and perhaps their very souls. The fate of Britain rested on the controlled advance of 10,000 tired, sick men in the deepest hour of the night. It was 4 o'clock in the morning on September 3rd, 1650. The darkness was absolute, heavy with thick fog, sea mist, and the damp smell of gun oil and cold earth. Across the narrow plain, Cromwell's cavalry regiments, the legendary Ironsides, moved like a single disciplined machine, their movements dictated by the silent commands of Generals Lambert and Monk. They were heading directly for the Scottish right wing, which was still in a state of chaotic congestion, many men asleep or still struggling to find their formation after the long, restless night descent. The attack hit with the brutal suddenness of a lightning strike. Just as the darkness was at its deepest, the sound of the English charge emerging from the mist like a monstrous iron beast. The English advanced elements slammed into the Scottish vanguard. Regiments crossing the shallow, muddy banks of the spot burn and immediately engaging the tightly packed horse and foot. The Covenanters, who had been expecting a leisurely siege or a mere skirmish, not a full-scale, devastating charge in the darkness, were caught completely by surprise. Their formation, already poor and crowded, immediately began to buckle under the sheer, concentrated, localized force of the English blow. This was where professional discipline proved to be the single most important, decisive factor. The Scottish soldiers were brave and fought initially with great fury, but when their ranks broke, their inexperienced commanders, many of them fresh zealots, could not restore order. The men were too crammed together. They literally could not maneuver, reload their long, heavy muskets, or reinforce their collapsing front line without crashing into their own men. Leslie's finest cavalry units, trapped by their own disorganized infantry, were unable to charge or deploy in the narrow space, rendering them useless. The sheer mass of men became a self-defeating, paralyzed obstacle. The New Model Army, in stark contrast, fought with terrifying professionalism. Their musketeers maintained steady, voluminous fire. Their pikemen held firm in disciplined blocks, creating an unbreakable wall. And their disciplined cavalry executed a precise, relentless attack, wheeling and reforming according to strict training. They didn't simply charge and halt. They rolled up the Scottish line like a carpet, the focused, concentrated weight of their formations turning the overwhelming Scottish numbers against themselves. The Scottish right wing collapsed in on itself with sickening speed. The fighting became a desperate, close-quarters melee, with the dense formations proving a fatal liability for the Covenanters, who were trampled by their own fleeing comrades into the muddy banks of the burn. David Leslie, watching the catastrophic collapse of his flank from his position at Spot House, desperately tried to issue orders to shift his center and left to counter the attack. But the terrain, the ravines, and the sheer chaos made immediate movement impossible. His massive army was too large for space, and it was being systematically torn apart from the inside out. Then the sun rose. As the first rays of light broke over the vast, cold expanse of the North Sea, they illuminated a scene of utter carnage, chaos, and irreversible defeat. It was at this exact, decisive moment that Cromwell, seeing his cavalry break clear through the Scottish flank and begin to sweep behind the Scottish centre, crystallized the moment with his famous battle shout, a statement of both military strategy and religious certainty. Let God arise, and let his enemies be scattered. The sight of the sun, The roar of the English guns and the unstoppable, sweeping momentum of Cromwell's attack broke the Scottish spirit completely. What had been a battle turned instantly into a terrifying, unmanageable rout. The Scots threw down their weapons and fled west, a disorganized mass of 10,000 men attempting to escape down the very road they had intended to seal. They were blocked by their own massive baggage trains and the remnants of their disorganized army. The new model army cavalry, now transformed from a trapped, desperate force into a relentless engine of destruction, pursued them down across the broken fields for 8 miles toward Haddington, ruthlessly preventing any possibility of a rally. The battle was over. It had lasted less than 2 hours, a masterpiece of sudden, shocking violence. The morning of September the 3rd, 1650, marked one of the most brilliant and completely lopsided victories in military history. The defeat of the Scottish army was absolute. In less than 120 minutes, Cromwell's forces had neutralized approximately 3,000 Scottish soldiers and captured a staggering 10,000 Scottish prisoners, seizing their entire artillery, 200 regimental colours, and all their stores. All this came at the cost of fewer than 20 English losses. The disparity was unimaginable. Cromwell, surveying the devastating yet miraculous result, was moved to profound religious conviction. He penned letters back to the Commonwealth Parliament, claiming the victory as a direct, undeniable confirmation of his role as the instrument of providence. The Lord, he believed, had personally intervened, judging the Covenanters' self-righteous zeal and finding it utterly wanting. The strategic consequences were immediate and catastrophic for Scotland. The Scottish Field Army, the only force capable of challenging the Commonwealth, was annihilated. The road to Edinburgh and Glasgow was thrown wide open, and the entire political and military foundation of the Scottish resistance was instantly liquidated. The Commonwealth, which had been on the verge of collapse and potentially civil war, was now firmly secured, its power projected decisively into Scotland. The human cost, however, was immense, even after the fighting ceased. The 10,000 Scottish prisoners, exhausted, often wounded, and many suffering from dysentery, faced a brutal forced march south toward England, under minimal guard and scarce resources. Denied adequate food and water, suffering severely from dysentery, thousands would succumb on the road, their agonizing fate a stark and grim reminder of the brutality of 17th century warfare. Many survivors were later imprisoned in horrific conditions in Durham Cathedral, where hundreds more perished, or were shipped to forced labor in the West Indies, or indentured servitude in the American colonies, a deep scar that remains on the history of Anglo-Scottish relations. Dunbar cemented Oliver Cromwell's reputation not just as a fierce partisan, but as a military commander of the highest caliber, a commander who understood that audacity, when paired with iron discipline, could defeat overwhelming numbers. It was the moment he proved he could turn a crisis of starvation and entrapment into a decisive, history-altering victory through sheer tactical boldness and the iron discipline of his troops. He found the one weakness in an otherwise impregnable defense, Leslie's fatal political and religious overconfidence, and he exploited it with a speed and concentration of force that was breathtakingly modern. The legacy of the battle is that of a powerful counterpoint, the triumph of professional discipline, organization, and clear military command over uncontrolled enthusiasm, political interference, and an army paralyzed by internal religious division. It ensured the immediate survival of the English Commonwealth, fundamentally changed the balance of power on the British Isles, and confirmed Cromwell's path to becoming the most powerful man in Britain. It stands forever as a testament to the fact that even when the odds are stacked 3-1, when an army is sick, surrounded, and facing imminent collapse, a single, decisive move, executed at the perfect moment, can turn a desperate trap into a glorious, unforgettable victory. If the dramatic story of Cromwell and the Dunbar campaign piqued your interest in military history, there are dozens more incredible battles waiting to be told. Comment below with the battle you think we should cover next. Hit the subscribe button to join our history community, and don't miss our next deep dive into the moments that changed the world. Share this video with someone else who loves history. Getting these stories out is the only way we can grow.